Welcome to We Need to Talk. The aim of this channel is to figure out how to find meaning in life and how to reduce unnecessary dissatisfaction and suffering. In this episode, we're diving into epigenetics. Epigenetics is a branch of biology that looks at how different parts of your DNA can be activated or deactivated depending on which kind of environmental stimuli you are subjected to. And this is important to note because depending on, for example, your diet or your way of life, that genetic information then is transferred to your children and their children and their children. So your decisions you take nowadays will be experienced, the consequences will be experienced by the rest of your family tree, so to say. So enjoy the episode. Super interesting and important to know how your biology works in order to figure out how to find meaning in life. And don't forget to subscribe. Let's go. Welcome everybody to We Need to Talk. This channel is focused on how to find meaning in life and how to reduce unnecessary suffering. My name is Henry, the host of this channel, and I'm joined today with Milena. Milena, do you want to quickly say anything you think that's important about yourself or you'd like to tell people? Yeah.
First, I know that you name yourself as unsatisfied adolescents. So as a scientist and a molecular biologist, I can tell you that we name as scientists as perpetual adolescents. So I think my place here today is something that unites your searches for the meaning of life and our search for the meaning of science. So briefly, I'm a molecular biologist and a geneticist. I work in the field of, to my modest opinion, one of the best fields of science is molecular biology, and in the field of epigenetics. So I have an experience of more than 20 years, but I shouldn't mention this. But anyway, I work in the field of aging and longevity. So yeah, I'm happy to be here and to share with you my knowledge on the meaning of life through the genetic perspective of you.
Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to do because, I mean, you also have a PhD, so you're like properly educated. You have as you said, like a long track record of experience. Actually, just one sec. I'm just going to turn my lights on so I can. There we go.
That's great.
So exactly, that's what I really wanted to aim at with this talk today is how to connect really the structure of the human biology to explain how to find meaning in life, because I think there's a strong connection, or one needs to understand the biology to really understand how to find meaning in life. So if we could can you shortly explain or what epigenetics is, and maybe also why it's important to understand, or why you think it's important to understand it?
Yeah, I'm pretty much I pretty much agree with you that the science and biology is in the center point of understanding life, because you know that biology means the science for life, from the Greek bios, life, and logos, science, and whatever. So this is one of the best sciences because everything you consider in biology is something that is in between, around us. It's on the planet Earth. Everything is biological, and you cannot be a human being, you cannot think, you cannot have conscious and subconscious without being able to understand the biological roots of this. So first, this is biology, and then we go to genetics. Because if I want to define epigenetics, I have to go all through these steps. So genetics is a science for hereditary. And this is something that was on the top of the contemporary biomedicine for more than 50 or 100 years. But now, since the sequencing of human genome, which ended about 3 decades ago, we understood that genetics is not deterministic. So it's not only the genes that tell us who we are, how we're gonna age, what kind of diseases we are predisposed to. But there are some other mechanisms that influence these genes to work in one way or the other one and help us to adapt to the environmental stimuli that come from the outside. So epigenetics means epi, something, again from Greek, epi, something above our genes. All these chemical modifications that happen on the top of our genes. And this is a hereditary information. This is information that we transmit to our next generations. So it's not only the genes that we transmit, it's not only the genetics, but also these chemical modifications that define the meaning of epigenetics. And briefly, epigenetics is everything. It is what we are, what we eat, who we communicate with, how we spend our daily lives, and everything influences our genes and make them respond differently through the chemical modifications. This is the epigenetics, something above our genetics.
Okay, awesome. So it's basically like one aspect of it, the way I understood it from also watching your TED Talk, which everybody should go and watch, is that you have the genome, which sits at the bottom, and then you have the epigenome, which sits on top, and it determines which DNA sequences are activated and which are sort of turned
Exactly.
off.
Perfect.
And is it correct then that if your parents, let's say, had like this genome and this genome was activated, that then the child's in the child's DNA or the child's epigenome, those same epigenomes are sort of also activated then?
Yes, depends on which regions of the genome we speak about, because there are genes that, when are marked epigenetically in the parents, are transmitted very stably in the same way marked epigenetically in the next generations. And there are some other epigenetic modifications that are pretty much faster, they're very dynamic. So you may have them, but you may not transmit them to the next generation. So it's very important where in the genome these epigenetic modifications happen. But all these traits like behavior, psychological traits, development of the human being is being influenced very stably by epigenetic alterations that had happened already in the sperm and in the oocyte prior, or even many years before even conception. So that's why sometimes we speak about periconceptional epigenetics. So it's very early in our decisions how to live our life and what kind of genetics and epigenetics we should transmit to our children. We should be very much responsible how we live our lives, because we already start to write the epigenetic code of our children. Because the genes we cannot change, they're stable, they are there, but we can change the way they work, the way they express themselves, in order to make some of the genes work in your body and not work in mine, in order to make us different, because me and you have a very little difference in the genetics per se. So less than 0.1% of the genetics in your body and my body are the same, but we are different. And even by mere look, by experience, appearance, we are pretty much different. We and it's epigenetics. This is the magic of epigenetics. So this is something that you can change, a hereditary information that you can change, consciously understanding the meaning of biology.
Okay, so like I have a tendency to like reduce the like super complex stuff because
Very
it's
cool.
I just don't like it's quite complex. So just say if I'm like reducing it too much or like simplifying it too much. But are you saying then, between humans the DNA, like the underlying DNA is quite similar, but the big difference is which DNA sequences of the entire DNA are activated and which are
Exactly.
deactivated?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And because this is like the question that really comes to my mind is, well, how do you activate the DNA sequences that are great, and how do you keep the ones that are bad, if there are any bad ones, deactivated? Or what's the right thing to do?
the right thing to do in the meaning of living, in the meaning of senescence, in the meaning of longevity, in the meaning of disease, predisposition and development are different things. Generally, if you can answer quickly which genes are good or bad, you cannot find this answer, because otherwise it would be a question for a Nobel Prize, believe me. Because all the genes in a human being, in a living creature, have their meaning. So there are no good and bad genes. Yes, there are some genes that lead to predisposition to oncology, diseases, and so on, but most of the genes are there because they have to be there to make us living organisms. So all the genes should function. Of course, some are silenced, others are not. But this is a process of development. So in the very early days, when the embryo is formed, all of the genes should work. All of the genes should work because they have to write the story of these cells to differentiate, to specialize in different types of cells, different types of organs, and different organisms and human beings. So at this point, all of the genes are functioning pretty well. So if there are some abnormality, this is something that it leads to genetic disease or to something really bad. But in the regular sense, everything functions pretty well, and everything is like pretty much fast expressing as genes. So you cannot say which genes are good and which are bad. All the genes have a meaning. But of course, you can try to understand from a scientific point of view, of course, and we scientists communicate this, that by your life choices, by your healthy diet, by your physical activity, you can switch on and off genes in the most healthy way, in the healthiest way for your organism. And this is the meaning and the logic that we look in our laboratory experiments, because we use different model organisms. We make them age prematurely. We make them eat unhealthily just to follow which genes are turned on and off, how they are turned on and off, and which are the chemical modifications. Because every metabolic process in our organism leads to development and formation of chemical signals. And these chemical signals have the possibility to influence with the background, with the genes, with the genetics, and modify them to put a makeup on the top. This is the epigenome, the makeup of our genome. I many times say that epigenetic modifications are the colors of our DNA. So all the
Right.
all the genes should function, and they should function properly. But what properly means has a different meaning in different stages of our development.
Hmm. Yes. Okay. I understand. You cannot judge really which one is. Well, yeah. The question that jumps to my mind is, after what you just said, is what does the DNA? Can we know what the DNA ultimately wants, or what it's like? What is it trying to do?
Yes, we know this is the heredity information that tells us that we should be human beings. So all the genes synthesize proteins, and these proteins have specific functions in our body. So the genes determine us, who we are, how we gonna age, and so on, but not so officially, and not so well determined, because not only the genes can influence our way of living, so it's also the epigenetic modifications. This is something that we learned after the sequencing of the human genome, when we understood that we are pretty much similar, but yet there are some other chemical modifications and other mechanisms that make us really different. Because if you take the homozygous twins, which share completely identical DNA, and you put these twins into different environmental conditions and raise one in one family and the other one in another one family, these are the twin studies, which are very famous now and are done by many scientists. you can just monitor very easily the same DNA, how it starts functioning differently depending on the environmental stimuli that come from the surrounding environment, from the way they are fed, the way they are raised up by their parents. And you can understand that even these homozygous twins start to differ even by appearance, by physical appearance, and from the biological perspective of their physiological functions, they differ much more even than you can even imagine, because one can develop schizophrenia, the other one cannot develop it, one can die by neurodegenerative disease, the other one should not develop never this disease. So these genes start to work pretty much differently depending on the environment and the surrounding stimuli.
Wow.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
is complicated, but
like,
not so much.
no, I completely understand what you mean. What I mean, I wouldn't it, if you have two identical twins and you put them in exactly the same environment, as in they live in the same house with the same family, they still will develop differences, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. But that, so it's basically what the thing that comes to my mind is, should we be panicking by making loads of false, like wrong decisions because the slightest uh like the like small environmental exposures to to stimuli, they can just it'll make you die or
No,
not
no, they
make you
cannot
die.
make you. They cannot make you die, but they can put some chemical modifications that can influence our physical appearance, our physiological processes. So we should not panic. We should understand that each choice in our life can lead to a change in the epigenome. But from the very beginning, we started with this: which genes should work, how they should work, which part of the genome should be chemically modified. This is something that happens on different levels. There are some epigenetic changes that are pretty much stable. And these are the epigenetic changes that happen during the conception and during the embryonic development. These are one of the most stable epigenetic modifications. So we should panic on the way the parents are planning to have kids and what they do during the period of conception and during the period of the embryonic development and during the first 1000 days when the baby is pretty much dependent on the mother and on the whole family. So these are the periods where most of the most stable epigenetic modifications happen. And this is something we should panic if we don't plan to live healthily, because the epigenetic that we will transmit will be not so healthy, will be not so happy, as I used to say. And we somehow doom our children to something that they probably will never experience as bad habits, but they are already predisposed to all complications that are led by these bad habits. This is something that we should panic. But when we speak about our daily life choices, if something as a choice leads to an epigenetic modification or chemical modification of our genes, and this is not, this is transient, it happens, and you have the possibility to erase it, to repair it, and to continue to live healthily. But if you continue for a long period of time, for years, to be exposed to some bad habits, for example, or to some bad environmental or surrounding stimuli, then these epigenetic changes from transient could become stable. And being stable is something that we should be panicking about,
Yeah.
because this means that this is something that will be tattooed in our epigenome stably, and we can transmit it after that, or it can lead to some really pathological processes like oncogenic development or something like premature aging or neurodegenerative disease and so on and so on. So we should understand that epigenetics is something that we can change. This is like the makeup. But if you put too much makeup for a long period of time, then it's very difficultly to wash it away. This is the same what happens with the DNA, with these chemical modifications.
Right. Okay. And if we, so I mean, with stable modifications, you mean like they'll hang around for a long time, like
Yeah,
they like really get ingrained into the
exactly.
okay. What, I don't know if you can answer this question, but what are good environmental stimuli? Or like what are, like, how do we, because I can, like, the easy things that come to my mind to stay away from is probably certain chemical drugs that might
Definitely, yes.
um like that, I don't know. But then what comes to my mind is, what about stress exposure?
That's
If you're
very
exposed to stress, like it like I watched a a and I watched another video on epigenetics where somebody
true.
explained how in rats, if the mother takes care of the baby rats and like nurtures them,
Exactly.
the baby rats start to form a kind of stress, like something in the brain that helps manage stress. And if the mother does not take care of the babies, the baby rats don't develop this stress coping mechanism, and then they experience more anxiety during the life. What are, like for example, the mother taking care of the baby, are there any other obvious habits or things you can do to improve, let's say, the which DNA sequences are activated that make the journey of life more fun, or more, like, more meaningful, or
Very cool. The example with the rats is something that is one of the best examples of how the early decisions of the mother can influence the children life after that, the adult life of the children. And if the mother is not taking care, as you already said, the child is experiencing a lot of stress, and this stress leads to the synthesis of cortisol. This is the hormone of stress. And the longer the period of this cortisol synthesizing period, or the period of stress, the more we get into the period of distress. So this stress is something that is really, really bad for us. And it's really important to have this in mind, because this distress that expose our organisms at a very early age, when, as I already said, this is the period when all of the cells are dividing, all the genes are functioning in a perfect way in order to build the grown-up organism, the adult organism. So this is the period where you, with these highly expressing genes, putting them on the influence of the cortisol, of high levels of cortisol for a longer period of this during this distress, is something that leads to very stable epigenetic modifications of the genome. They are called methylations. So specific methyl groups are covering these parts of the genes which are responsible for behavior of the adult children after that, which means that you just abolish them from the ability to adapt to different situations. You definitely abolish their neuronal development, their cognitive skills, because there are excellent tests for these cognitive abilities that are influenced by stress, because mice are a very good example of this. There are some tests that can allow you to follow the way they orientate under and without stress conditions. And these little rats that have been devoid of the mother's love have really big complications in their cognitive abilities. And this is something that happens even in Homo sapiens, in us humans. And there are many examples of children that have been rejected by the family, unfortunately. So they have very big problems after that in their life, because their epigenome is already changed by the synthesis of cortisol. And not only, there are many other stress hormones, the adrenaline, and so many others from the whole chain of the hormonal disbalance that happens in this. Organisms is something really important. We to understand the importance of this, and so this is one of the worst environmental stimuli. Of course, air pollution, of course, is also very bad. All the bad habits in our diet, the so-called Western diet, is scientifically proven that is not good for our health. And there are many studies, not only in the Western countries, but in everywhere. If you are exposed to a high-fat diet, this is something that pretty much influences your epigenome in not the best way. So you have metabolic syndromes, you are predisposed to obesity, you are predisposed to diabetes second type, and so on, to premature aging. So this maybe is the second factor. Of course, lack of physical activity is also one of the worst factors that influence our epigenome. So everything that you can consider as unhealthy is unhealthy because it's not only leads to some diseases, but it also predisposes your organism to many bad pathological complications after that in your later life. Because now you're young, everything functions pretty well, and you say, okay, this year I can enjoy this and that bad habit, without pretty much realizing that you already start to mark your epigenome, and some of these modifications will be pretty much stable, and they will be transmitted later in your life, later to your next generations, and to the next generations, to your future children. And it's something that young people should understand, because I many times lead conferences on reproductive biology, because many young people now have pretty big problems with their reproduction. Every 1 in 4 couples have problems, and they go for in vitro fertilization. Why? Because all the bad habits, all the way we live now under stress conditions, influence our sex cells, the spermatozoa, and also the oocytes, and they already have the epigenetic modifications that later do not allow normal fertilization. So the people should understand that each bad habit leads to chemical modification of their genes. And there
And
is one good example that I often give, is that you can be part of a family of centenarians, for example. So you're supposed to have the excellent genes and the possibility to live to your 100 years. But if you put these excellent genetics in some very bad environmental and surrounding conditions, then the possibility these excellent genetics to express its excellence is almost abolished, you know. And take another one compromised, for example, genetics that has some genetic predispositions to some diseases or some mutations, and so on and so on. If you put this genetics, which is already compromised somehow, in excellent conditions, then you have the possibility to have the compromised genetics working better than the excellent one. And this is due to the epigenetics.
okay, so basically, yeah, like within your own lifetime, you can, like, your environment has an enormous impact, basically.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, and does the, I don't know um if you've looked into, I don't know if it's part of your research or not, but evolutionary biology, if
Um,
you,
yes.
what does the DNA want you to do? Because it's like part of the like the epigenetics is basically the epigenome is activating some DNA sequences which influence your behavior, for example, or the way your health works, like is there a direction that it's trying to get you towards, or like is there a purpose of it?
The purpose of our genes are to make us living organisms. So all the genes that we have are shared almost the same by all other living organisms. The difference between us and the mice is less than 2%. Between us and the chimpanzees is less than 1.8%, following only the genetics, So if you make this comparative analysis, we can understand that the genetics is meant to make us living organisms, to make all the cells divide, to make all the cells repair their DNA if there are some breaks in the DNA, depending on the bad factors that come from the outside or the inside of the body. So the genes are meant to make us living organisms, because to be a living organism, you have to follow all the functions of the DNA, to replicate, to transcribe, to translate, and so on and so on. But how do they adapt us to the modern environment? Maybe this is your question, because ancient genes and the genes are meant just to make us human beings, to make us Homo sapiens. But what makes us different from the other living organisms is exactly the epigenetics. And if you follow human evolution, you can understand that this human genome has been shared by our ancient ancestors. They have sequenced the genome of the Neanderthalensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and they found that we share more than 60% of the same DNA, even the same genes. So they made this comparative analysis, and scientists understood that we are pretty much almost the same. But we have been living in different times. We have been having different experiences, different appearances, different physiological functions. So these genes are there to make us who we are, but also to be able to be modified by the environment in order to adapt us to the changes that happen. And I very, very often say that, okay, our genes should be very flexible, because, okay, we cannot change the genetics. I cannot modify my genes just because I want to modify them, but I can modify my epigenetics, because if my parents, grandparents, and great parents have been living under conditions which are not the same like today, yet these genes have been the same, 100, 200 years ago, 200,000 years ago, these human genes have been the same. But the changes in the environment are becoming more and more sharp, maybe every decade now, because before we spoke about hundreds of years of leap in human evolution. Now we speak about 10 years, we speak about decades now. So the only one possibility of these genes and these genetics to adapt is to be modulated by the surrounding environment, by these epigenetic changes that happen on the top of our genes.
And that's a topic I've thought a lot about. That I mean, I think you commented on my last when you watched my first episode of how I
Yeah.
said human evolution is a very conservative process. So if you kind of I forgot the scientific term for it, but I studied it. It's like a process where you forecast the like how the future human genome will, like how it will be modified based on how it has changed in the past. So it'll like gradually
Yes.
evolve. And the thing
Yes.
is, because it's in at least in history, it's been a very conservative, slow process. You would think it'll continue to be so in the future, but now the environment has changed so much
Mm-hmm.
that the human genome, like, does it know how to react to this sudden change? Because has it happened before that the environment has shifted so dramatically, so quickly?
Yes, yes. As I already said, this is the only chance of our human genome to adapt, because since the Asian changes in the environment, like the ice age and so on and so on, all these transitions that have been occurring in million times of evolution, they have adapted the genome just to survive, which means that all the systems for DNA repair have been becoming more sophisticated. But we didn't change much in our genes. Of course, during the human evolution, we received some genetic mutations, some single point polymorphisms that allowed us to adapt for consumption of milk, for example, which was something that we could not even think about it, but now we can drink milk without any problem. And this is again connected with the raising of a child. So this is something that happened. This is some kind of a mutation that happened. But the genes did not change that much. So Asian genes, as I already said, Homo neanderthalensis and some other Asian people have shown that the genes are almost the same. And even now we wear some of the genes that are pretty much characteristic for Asian people, which means that genes do not change that fast, unfortunately. So we should not rely on the change in our genes. And yes, if we follow the human progression, we can see that we can adapt to the technological progress, to the changes in the environment, which are pretty fast now, by the epigenome. So the more we know about the epigenome and how these chemical modifications happen onto the DNA structure, the more we will be able to adapt ourselves to the fastly changing environmental conditions. And not only our way of life has changed, even during this pandemic, we've been shifted to digital world. All of a sudden, all these teachers, students, scientists, everyone went crazy. The economics, everything for less than 6 months. So this is some kind of a stress that we cannot change the genes for 6 months. We need 6 million years of evolution, but we can change our chemical modifications on the DNA by trying to adapt. Adaptation is this: you receive the signal from the surrounding environment, it influences with your gene, interacts with your genes, influences the way they work by chemical modifications. And if this prolongs for a long time, like stress and distress, you can just put them inside of this structure of DNA, so that you can be pretty much well adapted when a second time some kind of a pandemic, for example, happens. So this is our chance. And
And
now we should be much more susceptible to understanding this, because changes are pretty fast now. As I already said, it's on decades. Now we speak about technological progress in decades. Before it was hundreds of years.
mhm. And when you say we will learn to adapt, does that just mean we will learn how to survive?
Also, yes,
And
yes,
is it because I mean what I wanted to ask is, when you say the DNA is the goal is to live, it's to sort of like produce a human
yeah.
organism. Can we scientifically go any further to say not only does the genome anticipate to live, but actually experience
Product.
something more than just existing?